Hi, and welcome to our webinar. We are so excited and glad to have you here joining us, some of you from quite a far distance as well. My name is Cheryl Boyer, and I'm the cooperative extension lead for this project, which is titled Lessons from COVID-19, Positioning Regional Food Supplies for Future Crises. And we are excited to share with you some of our results. This is the second of 4 webinars that we will have on this project, and we'll share a little bit more about that as we go along. But in the meantime, we are just really grateful for this opportunity that AFRI has afforded us as the pandemic continues to be challenging in multiple ways, and we are able to help in some way with that project or with that need as we find our way forward together. So for the next 60 minutes, we're going to spend some time recalling what our funded project is about. We're going to go over some preliminary results and where we are on some of the pieces of the project that we're working on that I will share with you in just a minute what they are and what you can expect from them and learn from them moving forward. So the first of those is the COVID-19 supply chain survey. So that's a big piece that we deployed this spring. So we have preliminary results to share on that project. We also are developing a consumer survey, and it is a little bit further or a little bit newer than that data. So it's still in the deployment phase, and we'll share where we are with you on that project. And then we have some wonderful information on all the online resources that are available on this topic. As you know, there's lots of information out there, and finding reputable sources and good information can be challenging. So we wanted to look at what had been put out. So we'll share about that. And then I'm going to share some information and expectations that you can expect to see from us on the extension and communications side of things, and some upcoming dates that you can save in your calendar and plan for. And there'll be more information on those soon. And then we will certainly have time for questions at the end. So if you have a question now, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. If there is, we've got a lot of our project team on the panel today. So if it's something that one of us can answer, we will go ahead and do so. If it's a really good one that we would like to record the response to, we may hold it until the end, but feel free to use that. Use the chat as well, but questions would be great in the Q&A box. And we will look forward to hearing what you guys are thinking about and what's on your mind as this topic moves forward. So I'm going to spend a few minutes going over the project. If you saw our first webinar, it's likely that you've forgotten it as well, since it was in January. We have lots that we want to cover, and we have our little outlines that we're looking at all the time as well. It's a very short period of time, a 2-year project, and it's a rapid response to the COVID-19 crisis project. So we have a lot to accomplish in a short period of time. But overall, we want to really share that, we're all aware that the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the core functions of our food supply chains, which are to make sure that we have safe and appropriate food for everyone. So I know even where I lived in Manhattan, there were empty shelves in the grocery store for a period of time. So we set out to sort of try to understand what are some of those factors and how can we prevent a situation like that from happening again in the future, while at the same time supporting the lives and livelihoods of those who are growing and producing that food. I know for many of us, our hearts are with our farmers and our ranchers and our specialty crop growers and everyone who is playing a core function in making sure that we have food in the grocery stores, and we want them to have a way to sell their product as well. So that's near and dear to our hearts as we develop this project. But also, because of the nature of this project, it's integrated, which means that we have both research and extension components to this project, and we're addressing the program priority area, economic security. So to that end, we seek to generate knowledge and resources that enhance the preparedness of the U.S. agri-food supply chains for future disruptions. And in that perspective, we're really looking at exploring the extent to which the regional food systems, so as opposed to sort of these really large national chains, but things that are a little bit more local and close to the area. So how we can help them be a supplement, augment those mainstream supply chains so that we make sure that that our food supply needs for the nation are met and that we can focus on ensuring the economic security of our small scale operations. So that is our overall goal for this project, is to sort of connect those pieces. And in this context, we also want to make sure that when we're talking about these regional food systems, we're talking about shorter supply chains, both in terms of physical distance and in number of transactions, as they than the bigger ones that cross the whole United States. So that's where we're going, and that's what our main goal is. Through this, our objectives are to assess the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on farm and food supply chain operations. And we're going to learn some about their specific goals for that part of the project here in just a few minutes. And we also want to understand the capacities and the structural vulnerabilities of these regional food systems to support their population needs. So where are the challenge areas and how can we support them moving forward? And we also want to develop resources and strategies for the current, we're still working our way through this pandemic, the current and future disruptions as they may occur. So to supplement that, we're developing some training resources that I'll talk about here in just a little bit, and to understand these local and regional supply chain participants at times of disruption. So we know that we have networks of people that can jump to support those who need information, and we want to make sure that they're prepared, training the trainer to help those people when in their time of need, when it arises. So this is our project team. We are all across the country. I'm right there in the middle in Kansas State University, and I'm connected to the project leads at the University of Minnesota and the University of Florida through our shared Center for Rural Enterprise Engagement, which is all about helping small rural agriculture-based businesses figure out how to navigate online marketing tools so that they can connect with their customers and maintain a viable business. So we also work with another center at the University of Florida, the Center for Public Issues Education, and that's through the UF-IFAS part of the University of Florida. And we have partners at with University of Wisconsin-Madison, talking too fast already, you guys, and at the University of California, Irvine. So you'll meet them in just a moment, but here are our faces. We are all across the country, and we're one of the larger project teams with 11 co-PIs and our graduate students. And, you know, we've really enjoyed our time together. It was about this time last year that we were putting our proposal together, and we didn't all know each other very well, but we've met monthly for the last year and really grown together as a team. And so it's just been a really rewarding experience for everyone. So these circle areas are our study region. So when we do the components where we're really focusing on the supply chain pieces in certain regions, we chose these areas because of their differences and some similarities. So you'll see that we have a Southern California region, we have an upper Midwest region with Minnesota and Wisconsin, and we also have a Florida region. So you will see that come up again, and we will share a little bit more details about that in a moment. We want to give a shout out to our advisory committee members. They are very diverse. They've been wonderful support as we brainstorm parts of the project and have really helped shape our perspective as we approach problems together through all of their different, through our disciplines and also through their experience in industry. So these are both academic and industry partners, and we're grateful for their participation. This is our overall project for the 24-month time period. So we just want to show you real quick a shortened sort of a timeline of each of these things. So each one of these boxes is a month. And so you can see these are the major pieces where we expect to work on these projects. And they include 2 surveys, analytical work, focus group and interviews, development and delivery of resources. So this first one is the impact survey with the supply chains. We're looking at consumer behavioral change as a result of the pandemic, an equilibrium displacement model, regional food shed analysis, food flow network analysis. And here's where we use our advisory committee to really help with brainstorming solutions. in these focus groups and interviews. So you can see that we have spread these meetings out over time so they can really be influential throughout the entire course of the project. And then we're also developing some communication, a platform and online resources, and some professional development training. So you'll see this W right here is where we are right now. We are at our second webinar, and we have 2 more to come in the future. And so this is just sort of our roadmap. And everyone jokes with me because I always have my sheet next to me with color-coded where we're going, where we are, and what we need to do to get to the next piece. So we did want to tell you, so our project is 24 months. It started in September of 2020 and it goes through August of 2022. And for the webinars, we have more than 380 people registered. So if you sign up now, you will get, we set it up as a series. So if you add it to your calendar, it will be there. It'll be blocked because they're pretty far apart. The next one is in November and the following one is in April. So if you add that to your calendar, it'll be there. And then you'll also get reminders. So we encourage you to share this with people you think will find it valuable. And we'll also record it and have the recordings available, and we'll email you with the recording at the conclusion of the webinar so you could review it, and it'll always be on our website as well, which is ruralengagement.org. We'll share that link here in just a little bit. Just a quick preview, the November webinar, we're going to provide updates from the consumer survey and the regional food shed analysis. And in April, we're going to provide updates from the analytic and qualitative work. So that will be happening very soon. And we also are mentioning Hikaru Peterson as our project lead, and she couldn't be here today, so she left me lots of notes, and she wanted to make sure that everyone knew that we were able to be a part of a panel discussion at the Just Food conference last week, which was very forward looking. So we're excited to be a part of all of these discussions moving forward. And with that, I am going to hand it over to the supply chain survey team to share some of their preliminary results. So our first speaker is Gustavo Oliveira from the University of California, Irvine.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, and thank you all for joining us here today or for catching us in the recording afterwards. So the supply chain survey was structured based on work that our co-PI, Dr. Krista Court at University of Florida, had already been doing on the impacts of natural disasters, particularly hurricanes, in the agricultural sector in Florida. So having that as our base, we expanded that kind of survey in a couple of different directions. First, we were more attentive to expanding the impacts not only from weather and climate related issues, but to the specific sorts of disruptions that we were identifying with the pandemic. And second, expanding from agricultural production to the entire food supply chain, going through processing, wholesaling, retailing, and foods service. The structure of the survey is organized as you see here on this slide. There's a brief introduction to the survey instrument itself, and then we move into the current status of the business. The survey is at the level of the particular business or firm. The first thing that the survey takers encountered was whether they were permanently closed, whether they closed temporarily but reopened, or whether they were open. And then there were several questions about the factors that led to closures, temporary closures, and so forth and so on. The following block went into specifics for their particular segment in the food supply chain, for questions about revenues and changes, employment and changes, as well as the linkages. It's possible also in the cases of CSAs or other types of businesses that they were engaged in multiple activities. For example, a farm that also engaged in some on-farm processing. In those cases, they received questions both about production and processing. And the survey was able to illustrate a lot of changes in suppliers, in supply channels, and so forth and so on. And after those specifics, the survey went on to look at the specific innovations that were adopted by those businesses in order to maintain themselves operating during those challenging moments, increase their resilience, and so forth and so on. So that's the block 5, business outlook and innovation. After getting a sense of what kind of changes were undertaken and how and why, then we end whether the business was closed or open with specific demographic information about the owners or managers, the person who is doing the survey, and other characteristics of the business. That's generally the structure of the survey that we employed. Next slide, please. Thank you. The survey we distributed it using Qualtrics, and the links were open from February 1st to April 15. They were distributed regionally across those 3 regions that Dr. Boyer pointed out. And we had a multi-pronged strategy for distribution. There were several organizations, from farm to table, basically, organization associations that we asked to help us with distribution. And there were also contacts of businesses in the food supply chain that we purchased from Data Axle for direct distribution as well. In addition to direct emailing, whether ourselves or through collaborators and partner organizations, we also followed up with some targeted postcard mailing for the businesses that we wanted to increase. And we also undertook phone calls, not only to identify contact information, verify, but also to follow up and try and increase the response rate. In the cases of the Midwest and the Southern California region, we were able to use gift card drawings also to encourage, to increase the response rate. I think I will leave my part here. This is where I turn over to Gigi.
Yep. Hi. Hi, I'm Gigi DiGiacomo at the University of Minnesota. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about our preliminary responses that we received for the supply chain survey. As you see there on the slide, we received 873 responses, with the lion's share of those coming from California and the Minnesota, Wisconsin regions. In all of the regions, though, the majority of the survey respondents, about 85, well, more than 85% there, were currently open for business at the time of the survey. Only 12% had closed permanently due to COVID and had remained closed, at the time of the survey. We did receive a wide range of responses from businesses that kind of spanned across the scale from small to large, but the median sales in 2019 was around $500,000. Okay, next slide. You'll see from this slide that we asked how business revenues were split across the supply chain. So any one business could have chosen multiple responses for this question. And so that's why you'll see that the numbers add up to more than 100%. But the majority of the businesses were generating revenue from the production ag or farming sectors, the food retailing sector, which would be grocery stores, and those came from independent stores as well as chains, as well as the restaurant segment. We did also capture a significant number of responses from businesses that are generating revenue from the middle parts of the supply chain, the processing and wholesaling sectors. And that was a major objective of the survey. We felt that there have been other surveys that target the farm population and the restaurant or retail population, but we were missing information on those middle segments. And so that really was a goal of ours. Let's see, what else can I tell you? I think that's about it. I think, our main interest in gathering this data was really to quantify the impact of COVID on business revenue. And so I'm going to pass it over to Krista, and she's going to tell you a little bit about what our preliminary results told us.
All right, thank you, Gigi. I'm Krista Court. I'm with the University of Florida, and I'm going to discuss preliminary results from the survey. And I say preliminary because we haven't had time to analyze everything that we got in from the survey that Gustavo just discussed. As Gigi mentioned, a majority of our responses came from the California and Minnesota, Wisconsin regions. It doesn't mean that we won't include our responses from Florida in the final analysis, but what you'll see today is a discussion of these California and Minnesota, Wisconsin results, because we had a quite a higher number of responses from those two regions. As we mentioned, we did have some earlier efforts in the state of Florida that we will be able to pull from in order to analyze Florida in comparison with these two regions as well. So the slide that you're looking at now, one of the questions that we asked was, compared to an average year, please estimate how your food-related sales changed in 2020. And we've arranged those supply chain sectors in sort of a W format here. So going from production agriculture to processing, manufacturing, grocery wholesaling, food and beverage retailing, and then restaurants. And you can see that the black numbers that you're seeing are the median responses to this particular question. The golden shaded numbers are the 75th percentile, or the top 25% of respondents. And then the blue are the 25th percentile, or the bottom 25%. The experience in California was quite bad. Even the top 25% of each sector fared worse in 2020 than they had across all of these quarters than they had in their average years. So the experience, though, it varied. If we look based on the spread between the top and the bottom 25%, you can see a significant spread, especially in certain quarters there, showing that some businesses were doing very poorly, others were doing not so poorly, or even in a very few cases, a slightly better in that particular year. But we're not seeing here, at least in the California results, a clear difference between upstream and downstream in terms of the supply chain. It does appear, though, that the worst effects were in Q2. So that April, May, June period, when things, at least here in Florida, things began to shut down in March. So that corresponds with that abrupt change in activity. And then you see a slight improvement as the year progresses in most of these segments. If we can switch slides, we'll look at what we saw for Minnesota and Wisconsin. And what we see here, which gives us a clear indication of regional differences in the results, is quite a different picture for the upper Midwest. Again, you'll see that W shape in terms of the supply chain operations, and these graphs are plotted against the same axes. So you can tell that the spread in answers between that top 25% and bottom 25% is actually smaller. In the upstream parts of the supply chain, so the production and the processing or manufacturing, the median businesses seem to fare equal or about the same in 2020 as they had in past years. And then unlike California, though, we do see sectors that were affected differently across the supply chain for this Minnesota-Wisconsin region. The downstream businesses seem to be hit more severely than the upstream in this case. In those downstream sectors, so that's the food and beverage retailing or the restaurants, the negative impact of Q2 was similar to what we were seeing for California. So one thing that we're doing is looking forward to dissecting sort of where these differences in experiences are coming from. And that's something that we hope to present in future webinars. And in addition to adding the experiences of Florida to see if they were similar to one of these other two regions or if they were different, completely different as well. We switch to the next slide, please. Just a few more peeks at some of the data that we were asking. One of our main interests was how the business had changed or how it had adapted to changes in response to the pandemic. So we were asking about changes in public health measures, as Gustavo mentioned, changes in revenues that we just saw, or changes in employment over time, or the labor situation. So we see here that in California, we saw a higher incidence of measures to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. So conducting daily health checks, requiring face coverings for employees, or even installing those social distancing barriers or dividers. The incidence of implementing those measures was higher in California than we saw in Minnesota, though a significant share of Minnesota, Wisconsin operations were also implementing these measures. If we switch to the next slide, we also see some differences in changes associated with labor. So we see a higher incidence of changing hours of operation or layoffs or furloughs in that California region, but a higher incidence of hiring new people when we got to Minnesota, Wisconsin. So there were definitely different changes going on in these different regions. Next slide, please. So finally, we asked how, what are the adaptations that these operations were making? And we did, again, see some differences in the results between these two regions. So for example, Minnesota and Wisconsin had a slightly higher incidence of sourcing input products from different suppliers or increasing the number of suppliers that they were using. And then finally, again, higher incidence in Minnesota, Wisconsin of selling through different sales channels or increasing the number of sales channels that they were using during this pandemic period. One of the things that we're interested in seeing is, how might this be associated? How might these differences in adaptation be associated with what we might describe as the more dismal picture in California that we were seeing in those previous slides? And whether it was, it just wasn't possible for some of these operations in California to make these adaptations. And if so, what were the barriers to those changes so that we don't experience them in the future? I'll now pass it to Lori Baker, who will discuss the results related to the diffusion of innovation section of that supply chain survey.
Thank you. As Krista alluded to, we saw some differences in how people responded in this crisis. And one of the goals within our original proposal was to understand how people were able to adapt to shorter regional food supply chains during COVID-19. And so we had a series of questions related to the theoretical framework of diffusion of innovations. And these are the characteristics of adoption within the diffusion of innovations. And the first one there is what we call relative advantage, which is essentially the perceived efficiencies gained by the innovation, in this case, shorter regional food supply chains relative to traditional supply chains. And so what I've done here is combine all of those that agreed in some way that there was a relative advantage to shorter regional food supply chains. So you can see that 43% of the people said that yes, in some way, there was a relative advantage during COVID-19 for them to convert to these shorter regional food supply chains. When we ask about compatibility, and compatibility means essentially how compatible is this innovation, the shorter regional food supply chains, within their pre-existing business or within their values? Does it match the things that they care about and the things that they're able to do? And over half of the people, 53.5%, agreed that in some form, regional shorter supply chains were compatible with their business or with their values. Then we went and looked at complexity, and complexity is how difficult it is to learn or how difficult it is to transition to a new innovation. So complexity, people agreed that it really wasn't that complex. 20% of the people said that it was complex for them to adopt to shorter regional food supply chains during the pandemic. And then that component of observability. So one of the ways that people adopt or make decisions to adopt is if they can see somebody else do this first. And that's often how people see that it's possible for them to do that. And so observability, how well can they see somebody else adopt shorter regional food supply chains? And in this case, only 18.7% said that they were able to observe someone adopting to these shorter regional food supply chains. So from an extension perspective, as we start to develop some of these resources, that observability is certainly something that we can look at how we could make this process more observable for people, because they are seeing some of the relative advantage and the compatibility. The complexity wasn't too difficult, but they weren't able to observe people doing it. So that's one of the outcomes that we'll continue to look at as we analyze this data further. The next piece in the diffusion of innovations component is really, who are those influencers or opinion leaders? So where are they getting information related to shorter regional food supply chains? And this is an initial analysis, as much of what we're talking about today is, but you'll notice that we asked people essentially their top 3 information sources. And so these are the people who listed these as their top information source, which is what's here. Commodity and grower industry associations were the top source for 23% of the people. Friends or family members, 14%. Neighbors or members in their community at 9.3%. The same for sales representatives from their suppliers. The local extension office was at 8.7%. So those of us in extension are thinking, oh, we could work on that, right? State government agencies, 8% there, and county or city government agencies were at 7%. And these are the ones that rose to the top. There were a few others. And as we continue to analyze these, we'll look at the second and third choices. Next, I want to talk very briefly about our consumer survey. The consumer survey will be launched this month. We had hoped to get it launched a month or 2 ago, but as these things go, it took us a while to make sure that we really get it right. And we want to make it comparable to what other people have done throughout the pandemic. We have based this on some of our previous work, both at the Pi Center and with some of our other partners across the United States. It will be a nationwide consumer panel of 1,000 people, so that we should be able to generalize pretty well. We will be sampling for characteristics similar to the US population. We are looking at food purchases and acquisitions, so similar to some of the things that Krista presented earlier, so that we can compare the producer supply chain side with the consumer side. The diffusion of innovations pieces that I asked about, we will be comparing those for people related to regional food systems. And we'll also be looking at demand elasticities based on their perceived public health risk. So those are the highlights and what you can look forward to when we host our next webinar and are able to discuss the consumer survey. And I believe now I am handing it over to Anissa Zaganel to discuss our environmental scan of online resources.
Thanks, Dr. Baker. Hi, everyone. So in order to make our content and resources more impactful from this grant, it was important to our team to understand what resources were already available out there for producers and consumers. To do that, we began with an environmental scan, which is a method used in communication fields to scientifically assess what is already out there. Our original plan for this proposal was to do the environmental scan and build a web-based resource hub to organize these resources. But by the time we were awarded this grant, the USDA Local Food Systems website was already established. So rather than recreating the wheel, we're just going ahead and adding other resources we find to their great website. So we began creating our sample by collecting resources from their USDA Local Food Systems website, but we knew there were other sources out there. So in addition to this website, we created a list of Google search terms. As a team, we compiled this list. Those were things like you can see here on the screen, farm resources, selling online, curbside pickup, food marketing, and all of these terms coupled with COVID-19 to make sure we were compiling resources from this specific point in time. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. Once we had this sample settled, we made sure there were no duplicates between our Google search term list as well as the USDA Food Systems website. And then our 2 coders began coding for credibility for each of the resources. That scale was on 1 to 3, with 1 being no clear source unknown, 2 being those commodity organizations online or newsprints, nonprofits, business or industry organizations, and 3 being the USDA. Oh, looks like I have a typo there. That's supposed to be USDA scientists, university scientists, and extension groups and things like that. So while we were also doing that, while we were also coding for the credibility, we coded for an about or introduction paragraph for each resource. So that was added to our code list. And from that, we were able to use textual analysis to later describe what resources are in our sample. So you can see from the table here, that shows that the highest, in total, we had 779 resources, and our highest level of resources came from the Commodity Association nonprofits, that level 2 of credibility. Our second level was from the university scientists, USDA scientists, university programs, and then we only had about 2% that didn't have a clear association associated with that resource. Next slide, please. And now our second objective for this piece of the project, to describe the resources, we did a textual analysis of the about information or introduction paragraph for each resource. And that created a long list of terms. And once we cleaned that data up a little bit and combined words that had singular and plural forms, as well as differing tenses of the same word, that resulted in 401 unique terms from 3 different dictionaries. After that list was cleaned up, we plotted those frequencies on a line chart and found a drop-off point around 36 terms. And even the 36th word table was too long for this presentation. And so I was only able to include the top ones of that table. So you can see here, we have 11 terms that were found to be used over 100 times. So for example, if farmer had a frequency of being used 20 times and farmers had a frequency of being used 20 times as well, we combined their frequencies to equal 40. So other higher up there, oh, you can go and go to the next slide. Thank you. So what does this mean for this project? In terms of credibility, there's definitely room for, like Dr. Baker mentioned, for university scientists and extension to play a role here. However, it's interesting, as she said, for the information sources, that in the producer survey, their first choice for information and opinion leaders were commodity and grower and industry organizations. So our credibility results from this environmental scan may be a good thing for those folks, since that's their first place they're looking. In terms from the textual analysis, big trends we saw were that resources were directed for farms and farmers, agriculture, local and healthy, and health and safety. Spreading was also a largely used word. So those terms are at the forefront of these resources, and a good thing to make sure that we're keeping health top of mind. Some areas for improvement that we saw that some terms that barely kind of made the list were restaurants and schools, delivery and deliveries. So maybe some of those processes could be improved from our resources. Something interesting to note too is that terms like extension, research, and science and scientific, those barely made the top term list. So there's definitely an opportunity there for folks in those areas to publish work and publish resources and serve as that opinion leader.
All right, thank you, Anissa. I will take it from here and cover what you can expect on the extension, cooperative extension and communication side. And certainly communication through our extension networks is something that is needed according to our environmental scan. So we're hoping to add quality resources to that need area that we've identified as a part of this project. So the website that we have created is called ruralengagement.org/lessons from COVID-19. Laurie or Anissa, could one of you pop that link in the chat? That would be helpful. And if you go here, we also have some resources on our touchless transaction series, but this is where the webinar will be archived, and any resources that we develop will be housed, so you can find things from that perspective, from that place. And also the resource center that has already been created is linked there as well. So we have 4 webinars scheduled. This is number 2 of 4. We've talked about that several times, so you have lots to look forward to for the upcoming webinars. The next one is in November, and the last one is in April. And then shortly after the next webinar, we're going to have our Train the Trainer conference. So we have picked a date for that. It'll be May 5th, 2022, which sounds impossibly far away, but it will sneak up on us. And it will be an online synchronous conference where you'll have an opportunity to engage and hear directly from our team on what we've learned. And we will share more information as we go through our time and our webinars on the details of what that will look like. But you can also expect an online course to be available in July or August of 2022. And this will likely be an asynchronous experience. So you can go in and learn at your own speed, but then our team will offer office hours for the project leaders, so that if you have your questions and you want to have them answered live, you'll be able to engage with them and work through some of your questions and needs for more information in that way. So we will also share that as it comes along, but that will be an opportunity for individual people involved in the supply chain to get a better understanding of what we have learned and how they can implement it in their organization moving forward. So we have lots of ways that we've done communication. Hopefully you have heard about this through our press releases, media releases. We try to share those broadly, and I noticed that this webinar was in the NIFA update last week, so hopefully several of you found us that way. But we are trying to make sure that everyone sees the content we're developing, and we will be developing some fact sheets on the extension side so we can add to that environment of resources that people can find valuable as they have questions and need to find answers from reputable sources. We also have a podcast. So this is actually the PI Center's podcast, Science by the Slice. And if you want to check that out at that link, you can listen to an interview with Dr. Peterson and Dr. Court as they talk about this project. And there's actually it's a 2-parter. So if you want to go and check that out, that is on that website, and we'll also link it on our main webpage as well. We've been busy presenting our content, what we've learned so far in conferences. As I mentioned, Hikaru was at the Just Food conference last week. We also have quite a few academic conferences that are coming up where we can share what we've learned from that venue. So hopefully in one of those ways or another, you'll hear more about the results as we move forward and have more concrete and less preliminary answers, but there's so much to dig into. So it's exciting to have so much good quality, deep research to really find some answers for everyone. And it will just take us a little bit to get through it all. So thanks for being patient and staying tuned in to what we're creating for you. So with that, we are at the end of our slides, but we have 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. But before we do that, we just want to remind you that the next webinar is on November 18th, and we will have results from the Consumer Behavioral Change Survey, the Regional Food Shed Analysis, and more as we move forward. So please share this link for the webinar registration with those you think would find it valuable, so we can share and get more people to learn. And then save the date for the Train the Trainer conference on May 5th in next year. And if you want to get more information, there's also a sign up on our website. And our project director is Dr. Hikaru Peterson at the University of Minnesota. And she has a really easy email address to remember. It's hhp@umn.edu. So please reach out to her directly if you want to ask about our project. And with that, I am going to take questions. I see that we've had several of them answered in the Q&A box, but if you have something else that you would like answered, please put it in the chat or the Q&A. And I'm going to shut this down, and maybe we can all turn our cameras back on. Project team, could you turn your cameras on? Now you can see all of us who are on here. Don't see any questions at the moment. We will stay on for a few moments if you do. Did anybody think of anything else they wanted to share in this webinar while we have this opportunity? There's a lot in their brains, I promise. What kind of questions did we have come through the Q&A?
I wondered if that might be a good place to start. In the Q&A, people were asking questions about if the PowerPoint slides would be available, and the PowerPoint slides are currently available for the past webinar on our project website. And when we post the link to this presentation, we'll also post the PowerPoint slides. That will probably be sometime early next week, before we get all of our ducks in a row and everything uploaded, but those will be available. We also had questions about whether there would be interim project reports available, and we won't necessarily have interim project reports, but we will have the fact sheets that Dr. Boyer mentioned. And so as we're analyzing the data, our wonderful Michaela Kanzer will be creating through the PI Center our fact sheets, and those will be available on the project website also for you to share with your stakeholders and use yourself. And then we just had a specific question about whether nonprofits were one of the opinion leader sources. They were an available choice for people to rank as their top 3. They did not appear in our initial analysis for people's number 1 choice, but we have not dug in deeply to the second choices and third choices. So we'll continue to look at those and see where nonprofit organizations are. So happy to answer additional questions if people have any.
We did get a couple more in the Q&A. And I love Jason's question, which is, how can we help to increase the use of Extension Network as a resource, because it was really low? So Laurie, I wondered if you had any recommendations, or Anissa. I mean, as an extension specialist myself, it kind of breaks my heart just a little bit, but you know, it's always something to look to build toward, is to get more recognition of the resources we have.
Yes, and I think one of the things Anissa and I have visited about the comparison of the results between the environmental scan and those opinion leaders in this area. And I think it's possible that our extension personnel at the first of this crisis anyway, weren't on the forefront of helping people with some of these issues. No fault of their own. Our systems tend to move a little slower, and a commodity organization can publish immediately to their website information, whereas those of us within extension tend to need to gather our facts. We want to make sure we have the appropriate research. We also probably have some systems in place where we have to submit our publications for review before they can come out. So I think it's possible that we didn't rise quite as high in those first choices because maybe we weren't as prepared early on to share information. I think more and more as we know and we talk to people, extension tends to be a reliable source for a lot of people, but we don't have a lot of mass knowledge where people understand where that information is coming from. So I think that's a thing we continually will struggle with, is to use those grassroots, make sure people know where that information is coming from. They may also have credited some of our extension work to their local or county government because our systems are so intertwined within those local and county government areas. So I think that's certainly something we're continuing to do. And as we develop more resources, we hope you're able to use them and pass them on and make sure that awareness is high for what we have available. I don't know if Anissa has something else to add, or anybody else on the team.
I think you covered it great.
This is Gigi. I was just looking at the next question from a Dr. Benati. I hope I said that right. And she asks, are we aware of similar projects conducted in the EU, and would we be interested in teaming up with other countries? And actually, that is something that I've been thinking about. It came up as part of the Just Food Conference panel that we just hosted last week, and there was some reference to the fact that a lot of the meat processors in the EU were not as affected, or that the meat supply chain was not as affected by COVID-19 as it was here, and that was a result of there being many smaller meat processors in the EU, the processing wasn't as concentrated as it is here. So when one plant shut down, it didn't affect, the large volume that it did here when we had, one of our big producers shut down. So it really got me thinking, and I would love to explore what other countries are doing when we begin doing these focus groups and these interviews, to start kind of, doing some of that forward looking about what can we do to help prepare for future crises or pandemics, and what examples do we have coming from other countries. So yes, Dr. Benati, if you have some specific examples or would like to connect over that, I would love for you to include your email in the chat box, and I would reach out and take it from there.
Yeah, no, I'll add to that there are efforts in the EU that are similar to ours that we know about. There's also a group at the OECD that was beginning to look at impacts to the global food system at the beginning of COVID-19, and I'm sure that they are continuing their efforts as well. So if I can find those links in time to some of the reports that they begin to release, I will drop those in the chat box as well.
I also add that we are also in touch with colleagues who are doing similar work in South Africa, Brazil, India, and China. And I'm very confident that there's going to be other teams that we are not in touch with who are doing similar work, or work that has interesting intersections that will be very exciting for us to explore. In Europe in particular, I think that the European Economic and Social Committee has done its own study, or they funded some study. The way to look for that, I don't have the references here myself, but their Agricultural, Rural Development, and Environment section would be the place to start looking for some of that work for Europe in particular. But absolutely, the more results that we get, I think the more we're going to be able to also find other teams doing interesting work. And just like the regional comparisons within the US are enlightening, the comparisons across countries are going to be extremely important as well.
Yeah,
I have a question for my fellow panelists and perhaps people in the audience, and that is, why do you think there are differences between the California and the Wisconsin, Minnesota regions? Any thoughts about that? Preliminary thoughts?
So I think I'll begin to answer that question. Some of our preliminary thoughts, especially looking at the differences in across the supply chain. So seeing that the entire supply chain was affected in California, and that it was more towards the restaurants and retail side in Minnesota, Wisconsin, the things that they grow and produce are very different in the two regions. So I'm suspecting that there are differences in the food supply chain for particular items within the food supply chain that were driving a lot of those changes. The other thing that is somewhat obvious is the differences in regulations or policies implemented that were experienced in the two regions were probably driving not only differences in what the businesses were and were not allowed to do, but also what the consumers either felt safe doing or were not allowed to do themselves.
Another detail that we're going to be digging further into as well is like Dr. Court mentioned, is the composition of the particular businesses. The California data was somewhat skewed in agricultural production to smaller farms that are producing for farmers markets. In addition to the different composition of crops as well. We did not get as much participation in our sample from the kind of larger scale agribusinesses that are selling more, to the more, established processing or export. I mean, there's a lot of export in general, but that might be part of it. We're going to be looking a bit more into it as well. But I also suspect, like Krista mentioned, that the way that the restrictions were imposed and enforced in California, for example, around restaurants, it seems to have been, like stricter than in the Midwest, and also compliance maybe was also a differential factor.
Mhm.
So on the retail end, there might have been something.
That was a good question. Thanks, Michelle. Along those lines, we have another question in the chat from Alan, and he wanted to know why the responses from Florida were so low. And we do have some ideas about that, but I'm gonna throw that one to Krista.
I have plenty of ideas. So as we mentioned more than once in the beginning, we had several efforts that were survey oriented going on in Florida prior to this project beginning. So we had already surveyed at least the production part of the food supply chain here in Florida twice before this survey came out, and once relatively recently, right before we released this survey. So I think in a lot of cases there was survey fatigue. People just didn't want to answer another survey by that point. That was true in what many researchers were experiencing in whether they were studying the food chain or not. There was survey fatigue was really setting in by the time that we released this survey. Other than that, I'm not sure. We implemented the same distribution techniques that the other two regions did, and we just didn't get that high of a response rate. But as I mentioned, we do have those responses from the two prior efforts, so we will be able to pull some information from those to make sure that we have a comparison to that third region by the end.
Thank you, Krista. I thought that was
Perhaps also the compensation. I mean, Florida was the only of the regions that did not include compensation for participants. And, in Dr. Court's team experience work, like surveying agricultural production, had already been able to do that successfully without compensation. So the hope was that that strategy would have worked through, but maybe when it went into surveying those more like downstream links of the supply chain without compensation, which was provided in the Midwest and California, that might have made a difference as well. So I wouldn't, don't feel bad. I don't think like Dr. Court said, we have other data that we can bring to the analysis.
Oh, that's a really good. Stay tuned. We have just a couple of other questions. One of them from Giselle is that in the future, will the project encompass global disruptions or comparisons with the global environment? And I think right now that's beyond the scope of what we proposed for this project, but I expect in the future there probably will be some really good collaborations. And as this data is published, there will be an opportunity to compare what's happening all over the world and sort of like some bigger review or meta analysis of what people are seeing. So hopefully they're asking similar questions and we can learn some more from that. So I think there was one more question and I have too many screens and can't get to there was one in the chat. Was there any intelligence collected about food waste during this transition? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that was a question, anything that we were asking for this particular one, but I think there is work happening about that in the world.
That's correct. And if we go back to what was the question about Europe earlier, I know there are several groups in Europe looking at food waste changes during the pandemic, but it was outside of the scope of this particular project. And if I can go back to that previous question one more time. So our expertise here at the Economic Impact Analysis Program is in regional economic modeling, and we have had several other efforts to look at changes in the global economy that are arising from some of these shutdowns. So we do have some publications out already related to that. So if Giselle's question was not necessarily related to only the food supply chain, but how does this fit in the context of larger global disruptions that were occurring because of some of these measures to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, I can share those resources as well.
Awesome. I didn't know that. Thanks, Krista. Okay, last call. We've got about 2 minutes left. If there are any more questions, we'd be happy to answer them. And if not, we'd be happy to give you back a couple of minutes of your life. All right. Seeing none, thank you. And we are so glad you joined us and you stuck with us for this entire presentation. And for those of you who are watching the recording, thank you for engaging with our project. Look forward to our next webinar on November 18th. And we will see you again soon and we'll have lots and lots to share. So thank you. Have a good day.